Just a couple comments for community members who might be here or listening, just to give a backdrop a little bit to the presentation today. So this has been a board interest, a board-driven process to consider moving start times. So staff members have been working hard for a long time, and we've got a lot of community input and engagement that we've done in order to inform the board as we have this conversation and move towards a decision, which, as you said, is not tonight. So it's part of a larger trend of moving school district bell schedules later that align with the American Medical Association guidelines, or at least try to get closer to those guidelines for young adolescents, particularly adolescents. Here in Colorado, Cherry Creek as well as Thompson school districts have moved their start times, and we are not alone in this discussion as to whether that's a good idea for us. We have had several community engagement sessions where we've gone out and invited people to come listen to us and talk to us about their interest or their concerns about this process. And I would encourage you, if you're trying to get informed, to look at our website page. We have a whole page on this conversation with a lot of information there. So if you want to dig in and see what we're hearing from our community, other than tonight's presentation, I encourage you to do that. We also had a scenario committee who invested a lot of time. This included community members listening to and analyzing the feedback that we've gotten so far. There's a lot of interacting factors as we look at these alternatives, including busing, athletic events, athletic practices, other extracurricular issues, schedules, staffing, and so it has been a thoughtful process. We're trying to move efficiently, but at the same time take the time and the thought that's required, so that if we do go in this direction, we'll do it wisely and in an organized fashion. So tonight is just a information and discussion item, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, and I would add that one thing I was putting in the emails today is that it's also an opportunity to make sure we put questions on the table that board members still need to be addressed. So maybe not all our questions are answered yet, but maybe we can pull those questions out. Now, Dr. Smizer, were you going to have somebody present this slide set, or?
Yes, the lone man in the corner of the room.
Okay, so we'll turn this over to
Mr. Nielsen will take
Mr. Nielsen
again.
okay.
Thank you, Dr. Smizer, President Fev, and board members. I feel like I've been talking about late start since school started this year, we've had lots of opportunity to talk to the public. I've appreciated seeing many of you at our community engagement sessions. I think that's given you an insight probably into what you'll see as we go through the slides tonight. You've obviously had a chance to preview them, and I suspect much of the feedback in the 500 pages of feedback you'd heard before, and some of that was feedback that was directly back and forth with you. So you've been part of the process, and we've appreciated that as we've gone through this. And a couple of you had a chance to sit with us as we spent some time with the DAB last week and had them spend their second meeting talking about and trying to give us feedback in this process. Sandra talked about some of what has happened. I think it is important to reiterate that we've been exploring this now for about a year, maybe even a little over a year since you first asked us to start digging into this. When you look at research, you have the AMA and you have the APA and the AAP. All three medical groups all make the same recommendation of high schoolers starting school after 8:30 as their general recommendation. I think that was at the center of your request for us, I think, a year ago. That we had community input. We started our initial input was a survey we pushed out in February. We had a large response, and one of the best responses we've had from our community of any survey, and ultimately until we sent out this last one, which we had a better response for. So both of the surveys that have gone out in regards to late start have had great responses from our community in terms of feedback at the two different stages of our research or our digging into this. Again, we had a start time scenario committee. That committee was made up of staff members from all 4 feeder areas. We had community members, and we had staff members from sites as well as staff members from central office that were part of that committee. Ultimately, their charge was to come up with some scenarios that we could take out to our community engagement sessions that happened in September. During the month of September, we were out in each of the 4 feeders 4 Thursday night in a row for listening sessions, a chance for us to share what we were participating in, but also to try to answer questions as best we could at that time. All of those questions are documented in the 500 pages that you received a couple of weeks back, all of it in the packet that's part of tonight's agenda. We had some student focus groups. We ended up having a student focus group at 3 of the comprehensive high schools, 2 of them with relatively about 15 students in them, and then we had 1 focus group of close to 100 students at Rocky Mountain High School. We also participated and had some conversations with our principals. Principals talked to a couple of different times, secondary principals, again, just last week. The second survey we sent out, we had 13,500 responses. The first survey with good results was just a little bit over 10,000. So that gives you an idea of the responses we received for the second survey. As we've talked about before, you, board, have heard all this. For those listening for the first time, we proposed, out of that committee, we had 4 different start times. We'll call start time number 1 the current start time. Everything stays the same. The scenario A is really just a change for high schools, moving the high school start time to 8:30. Current start times for most middle and elementary, I say most, because CLP Middle School, their busing is attached to Poudre High School, so they kind of float wherever Poudre is going to go. Then we have scenario B, which moves our high schools. It's our first what we call a flip model, which moves our secondary schools later than many of our elementary schools. Moves our high school start times to between 8:55 and 9 o'clock. Moves our middle school start times back about 20 minutes for most of our middle schools to 8:05, and actually condenses our elementary times to starting between 7:45 and 8:50, with, I believe, in that scenario, 10 of our elementary schools starting at that 7:45 time slot. Then scenario C moves our high school start time back just a little bit, 5 minutes. Moves our middle school start times back to 8:35, and condenses even more the gap of time for elementaries. All of our elementaries start between 7:45 and 8:40. So we're going to start to take a look at some of the data we got back. When we sent out this second survey, what we asked the respondents to give us information on was the 4 different scenarios that you just saw. And we really asked it 2 times. We asked it once for them to do it cold, just responding to those 4 scenarios without looking at the specific times for their individual students or their schools they send their students to. And what you see here is the current start times had a 36% response rate. Scenario A came in at 25 and scenario B 27. Scenario C trailing all of them by quite a lot at 12%. The next slide is the same information but with that second question. So we wanted to see how much did the information change when individuals were able to see how did it affect themselves, their individual schools. And you see it did change slightly, although our current stayed exactly the same. So current was 36%. Scenario A went up slightly. Scenario B went down slightly. Scenario C actually went up slightly. Part of that, I think, is when you start thinking scenario A, when you start looking at your actual school, lots of schools stayed exactly the same because the only schools that changed in there were the high schools. And so I think that gives us some rationale for why those numbers may have changed, but they changed slightly as we thought they might. We wanted to give you an overview of who responded, and what you see here is all the different groups, students, parents, all staff, and community. This is just a representation of what you saw on the other slides in terms of, but broken out by subgroups. In each group, you see the current slightly higher, but not substantially higher than some of the other start times. And you see we had representation from students, parents, staff, and I think we had about 100 members of our community who responded as well. This breaks down how the individual groups responded. This one tells you that our students said current start time, they liked scenario A, and then scenario B and C came in at the quite a bit lower. I will say in my interaction with the student groups, it was interesting. Their feedback, and you saw this in the feedback in the, really you saw it throughout a lot of feedback, it had a lot to do with end times. There a ton of focus on the end time. We heard that at the community engagement sessions. We saw that in the feedback from the surveys. And this, I think, represents what I was hearing from students was the end time seemed to be one of the challenges for students. We get to all of our parents' scenario, and they were 34% for current. They liked B better than they liked A or C. Our staff leaned toward current start times, and they also liked B better than they liked A or C. Our community members came in with current being their number one. They also liked B better than they liked A or C. One of the things we also felt like doing, and board, you saw some representation, I think, in a different format today that Rob asked about. We were attempting to do something similar to what Rob was asking about today, and that what we wanted to know was when we asked the individuals to rate all four, we wanted to get a sense of if you picked X as your number one, what did you do for your second? And see what the patterns were. And so the next 4 slides will walk us through that. This is individuals that picked current for their number one. You see they picked the scenario A. If they picked current start times as their first, their second choice was scenario A, which makes some sense. It's the closest to current. Very little changed. If next was B, although you see B and C were quite a bit behind. This group is the group that picked A first, and when you see that group, they essentially split and said, we like A as our first. About half of them said they liked current as their second choice, and the other half selected scenario B. And so you see that was a split from that A. The group that picked B as their first choice, they again split themselves. A few of them liked current as their second choice, but the majority went either for A or C. And then if you picked C as your first choice, the majority of those people had B as their second choice, with A coming in about the same as current start times. So that was a way for us to visually show, I think, the graph you saw going back and forth today was another visualization, and I think Dwayne today was able to take a graph and look at it a couple of ways where you can add 1 and 2 together and get a representation that in those scenarios I think show A slightly higher than current or B. Our findings, I think, overwhelmingly showed us that C was the least popular So I think if there was findings that we found, it was that C was the least popular. That was pretty clear and evident to us. Respondents who preferred A do not consistently prefer all scenarios with a later start time. We wondered that when we went in the survey. Would we see, if you liked a later start time, would you overwhelmingly pick anything with a later start time? And that's not what we ended up seeing. As I talked about, they split themselves between current and B. And so for us, the scenario did not give us a clear result one way or the other. Our community is split in terms of what they desire, with there being a little bit more, as we do the model where you identify your first and your second, there is a little bit more energy for an A model than there is for current or B. But it's a close in terms of what our community is saying here. There's not a clear hands down, here's a direction that the community thinks we should go. So additional considerations. We heard a lot of feedback at the community engagement sessions, as did you, both in emails but also in listening to the questions that came out around if we end up with later end times, how do we respond? So one of the things we did was we put together, really what we looked at is we said, okay, if we had a pretty perfect scenario to do this and do it well, and have lights so that we could do all the activities that we feel like we need to do, this would be a way to do it. That would several fields at each site. Right now there's an equity issue with lights in our district. Fossil, for instance, has a lit football field. Other sites don't. So that creates an opportunity when, particularly when we get into the month of November. But right now we even struggle as you move into October. You think at French Field, we often, by the middle of October, are turning the lights on for a game there by 5:45. So your time gets pretty short. And for our football, soccer, some of those sports that can get a little long in the tooth in fall, I think football can go into early December if they go all the way. Having some way to mitigate that. Now, we've talked to some other districts. We know they have not, Cherry Creek or Thompson did not put in lights. They have found other ways to mitigate the opportunities that they have for students. Cherry Creek gets out a little earlier than we do. And they also have figured out how to condense sports, which I think is certainly possible. It's going to be challenging to compress your athletics when you get into November and you're starting to look at like it is today, where it's dark by a little bit before 5 o'clock. So having some way to mitigate that. Thompson works with the city for some of theirs, so they use some of their lit fields in the city. We'd have conversations around the same. That would be an option. I think we build as we build the school up in Wellington. Wellington has a couple fields already that are lit. So looking around at what the resources are, but also wanted to make sure this was something for us to think about as we go through it, and something that does make the mitigation and opportunities for students easier to move through if in fact we look at over a couple of years and figure out how do we create fields that allow us to practice and have distributive practices into the evening, as opposed to practices that are truncated by the sun going down. So just something for us to think about. We felt like this was us doing due diligence based on feedback that we were hearing. I think it is important, if we think about this model, this is not something that is easily pulled off in a year or two. That is something that would take substantial planning and time to put in over time. So if the decision is to move in 19, our task will be to mitigate without lights, just because we wouldn't have them anyway. So that would be a task. So I would answer, I think that was a question that several board members had, was about lights, and so I wanted to address what others have done, in addition to why we went through this exercise with Russ and facilities to figure out what would the cost be if in fact we were to do it in this model. One of the other pieces of feedback we heard a lot You did too. Several of you talked to me about it, right? And then I also heard it from the students, was the challenge around the end time. I had a conversation with that feedback group at Fort Collins High School, and it was interesting because they all said A to start with, every one of them at the table. And then one of them said, well, I actually like the start time for B, but I don't like the end time. So then I broached the subject with them, and I said, okay, each one of you, what would the end time be that's too late? And they went around, and almost all of them said 4 o'clock. Anything after 4 o'clock just feels too late. Now, I will also say that feedback session was unique. The other ones I had with students, there was more worry even about a 4 o'clock end time in terms of jobs. So that's big for the students that work, is thinking about what happens if I end up having to go to school till 4 o'clock and I have a job that starts at 4 o'clock, which many of our jobs now, students could access a 4 o'clock job. So I just want to be fair that that's what's there. But the group that I got into that conversation with at Collins landed on 4 o'clock as an end time. We heard that a tremendous amount from community input and at our community feedback sessions. So one of the things that we ended up doing, and Matt was awesome in allowing his team to continue to crank through scenarios, we asked Matt if we could take the late start minutes that we didn't pull out of the scenarios to start with. So we had the ability in the scenarios to continue with the late start depending on how we landed. So we asked if we could compress the busing schedule for both A and B, meaning we could move the end times up a little bit. It did not work in A. A turned out to be quite expensive to change the busing schedule because everything already was kind of compressed together. But in our scenario B and C, it would have worked, although for us it didn't make sense to do it with C because there was not a lot of energy around it to begin with. But in scenario B, we were able to move the ending times of our high schools up to the 4 to 4:05 end time. So we're able to get it in the same ballpark with the ending time of A, condensing it, taking the option out of it for a late start, but essentially the high schools would have a late start every single day. They would start at 9 o'clock if scenario B was the choice. So Matt was able to work it, so we were able to do a modified scenario B that has everything else the same as in B. So the elementary start times are exactly the same as they would be in the regular B. The middle school start times is the same as regular B. The high school start times are the same as in regular B. Their end times move up to that 4 o'clock end time. The cost of it is exactly the same as it was in B. So there's no extra expense. It just shortened their day, has us still meeting the number of minutes, but doesn't have any extra time for the late start or early release. So as we come forward to you tonight, we feel like there really are 3 reasonable options for the board to consider as you go through your process and to ask questions about and try to dig through, and happy to answer whatever questions we can answer tonight. But those 3 scenarios that we feel like are viable are the current start time, scenario A, and I just talked a little bit about we don't have the ability to shrink the busing time for A, but I wanted to make sure that the board was aware that because of that, we have some extra minutes. So those minutes that are the late start minutes right now are in that schedule. So A high school could make a decision to end class time 20 minutes before the buses leave. And those students that are driving could go home. The students going to athletics could start 20 minutes earlier. So they'd have the flexibility to start those things earlier. A downside to that would be the students that are on buses would have 20 minutes that we'd have to supervise. There'd be some supervisional challenges on a day-to-day basis. As a former principal, that would provide some challenges. Right now, that's what happens on the late start. If you're a bus student, you show up at Pooter at the normal time. You have flexibility to go over to the corner 7-Eleven and get a big gulp and come back by 9 o'clock. But as a principal, that supervision 1 day a week before school is a lot different than 20 minutes every day after school. Not that that's right or wrong. I just want to make sure that you are aware that that's in there. That would give the high school some flexibility with their schedule if A was the selection. And that Modified B, we feel like Modified B is a better scenario than B, given the feedback we've had about end times, and the only difference being high school end times. We feel like Modified B replaces B. It's just a better scenario to bring forward. And so we believe these three are three solid ones for you to consider, to have conversations, and to ask questions about and see what we can do to help with those. I think you're already aware of, that we've at the November 27th will be another opportunity to have a conversation at a work session. There will not be a presentation that night, but we'll have available whoever from the district we need to have to answer remaining questions if there are any. That we would ask that the board take action, whatever action you're going to take in December, given the challenges that we move into as we move into second semester with registration and everything for the high schools, middle schools, and elementaries to know what the next year is going to look like. December is critical. And then should we decide to change start times, that as soon as we are ready and have the information, we'll begin to execute a communication campaign to alert the community of the decision, what we'll be doing, the change that would be made if that's the decision that you make. We would start that in January, and that would be a big part of the spring semester would be communicating and figuring out how to do things, and from bus routes to athletics to how are we going to manage the opportunities that kids are provided in 0 hour. Does that have to be a blended approach so teachers still have opportunities to collaborate, students still have access to teachers, and you have a chance to do other work? I think all that is up for guidance from the board in terms of how we move through that. And then we would continue to work on those implementation efforts as we move into spring. With that, I'd love to open up for discussion.
Okay, thank you, and I think you did a credible job of keeping that interesting, the 25th time you've gone through it. No, we've all heard you, but you've put enough new information in that it was good. How about that? Okay, board members, my intention is to allow whatever time you want to get questions on the table, asked, whatever you want. So who would like? Kristen, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing all. It's a tremendous amount of work, and for taking into consideration the feedback that you got to come up with a scenario B modified. So that's some great work there. I do have a question on. So, you gave us on scenario A sort of like what you think would be the troublesome spot for principals, which is the 20 minutes a day. Could you use that as a late start still? Could you still have a late start Wednesday and use it that way?
You certainly, yes, they certainly could.
Okay.
Yeah, they certainly could have a 10:30 start time on a Wednesday if that's what they wanted.
Okay.
They would have the minutes to do that. I mean,
Okay.
that would be, those minutes are in the schedule.
So they're in the schedule, and they could just use them however they wish. So if they wanted to do, 20 minutes a day or a late start, whatever day they chose.
Yes.
Okay.
They would have some flexibility in that.
Awesome. And then in the modified B, so we're removing the late start. What do you see, or what have you heard from staff and students, and as, if I can say, the worst part of that scenario, in the sense of, like, if you don't have a late start, if you don't have those extra minutes, is there something in there that is worrying staff and students with that proposal?
So one of the things I've heard is, and I'm going to say I think it's a perception. I think if in fact that's the choice, it works itself out. But is the idea that we lose the late start when in fact we have it every day. But there is the understanding right now that a Fossil Ridge High School starts 4 days a week at 7:30, and then they start at 9 o'clock once a week. That gives a chance for students to meet with teachers, and for students to collaborate with each other. They do their meetings during that time. So that's one of the things I've heard. I think it's feasible that you could mitigate and you could control the schedules that your staff work, that front-end loads the minutes that they're working to before school, and they leave not too long after the kids leave, which gives you the same flexibility. How you decide to use that and what principals decide to do with 0 hour impacts that a great deal. If principals decide they're going to have many 0 hours, you lose the ability to have a good staff meeting because you have a whole bunch of teachers that are teaching classes before school. I also would say you hear and you saw in the comments, if you have a whole bunch of 0 hours, then people start to question what's the purpose of the late start. And so that you end up with both those scenarios. But the piece about losing the late start, the 1 day a week, I've heard a lot from students and from staff, both. The other thing I'd like to say, Kristen, is you acknowledge the work. I know Lauren Hooten is out there watching, and I just want to acknowledge the work that she does is phenomenal. Thank you, Lauren, for all that you do for this and everything, but this is phenomenal.
Okay, Rob?
Great. So following up on some of that discussion of 0 hour stuff, a couple of things. Even if there's some 0 hour activity, and I want to ask a broader question about that in a second, but as I understand it, even if there's some 0 hour activity, students will get, even students taking advantage of that 0 hour activity, will likely be getting some benefit from this. They won't get the whole benefit, but they'll probably get some benefit because even the 0 hour would start later than the earlier start time potentially.
I think the answer to that is yes on a couple levels, and I say that partly because we have 0 hour going on right now. So we have 0 hour that starts earlier than 7:30. So we have some classes that are starting 6:30 right now at the middle school.
My kid had some at 5:45.
5:45 for Rob's kid. He was the only one though, Rob, that had to go 5:45. So we have some of that going on right now, but I do believe
I think it was 5:45. It was early, though.
the impact would be different depending on which choice is made. If your decision was B, and you all of a sudden don't have to start your 0 hour till 8 o'clock, and you do a 45-minute 0 hour 4 days a week, or 3 days a week with some blended approach, yeah, I mean, you've added a half hour to their potential for sleep just by doing that, and they're still getting class before school. And potentially they are able to decide to opt out of from students that some students truly believe starting school early is good for them. So there's a choice to do that then,
Exactly.
as opposed to a mandate, which is what we have right now.
Yeah, and I guess I may have exaggerated on the 5:45, but it certainly seemed like it when he was going off to some of those music classes and whatnot. So
You're not wrong in that we have some classes that start early right now.
yeah, okay. So the other thing about potential morning activities, let's call them that, because it's not only potentially, classes per se that would start then. One mitigating approach, right, to some of these concerns about athletics or extracurricular activities or some other things might be to put some of them before school, and then there's the question about who's getting the benefit, and it might not be the whole benefit, but it's still part of the benefit like we talked about. However, I have a broader system question, which is, I know Cherry Creek and Thompson both took the approach that said, hey, if your stuff was already going on before school, you can leave it there. But we don't want any wholesale movement of things that were going on after school to before school, because in fact we want to give the most benefit to the most students, right? This partial benefit was something that they certainly talked about, but chose to try to get the full benefit to more students. Does the staff have any thoughts or recommendations on, I mean, you've talked about, flexibility that provides, but do you have any sort of broad recommendations on how we approach that question here in Pooter if we make a change?
Oof.
I could weigh in as
Yeah,
well.
that's-
Actually, we haven't gotten far enough in the detail. I will say this is going to be one of those things where the details matter. And so we would really have to dive in to see what is going on exactly in detail. I understand that, some of the concern is just we did all of this and then nobody's taking advantage of it. But on the flip side, we do have darkness at least part of the year that will impact one way or the other. And we don't have the answer to that question. I think it's one of the things we'll have to find our way through.
Now, is this something where you would need some clarification before you make a decision, Rob?
So the answer to that is no. I'm confident, without putting too much burden on anybody, that the staff will be able to work out what the best thing is to do, and will search out the best solution for the broadest number of students, even if that means not everybody gets all of the benefit. So I'm comfortable with that. I was just curious whether that was something that was sort of coming along with this, or it was something that was going to be worked after. And it's pretty clear that it's going to be worked after, if in fact there's a change. That's what I'm hearing.
And I appreciate your confidence, and I think that it's likely that we'll learn things in year one and then revise for year two going forward.
That's fair.
I would add, though, that I appreciate one of the challenges with the sweeping approach that you can't do any. We have other things that we're looking at, right, where we have full buildings right now. And so having some flexibility in what you do to mitigate that, if it works, gives you some other options. So having the ability for us to work through it once we know what our marching orders are, I also appreciate the trust that we'll do what's right. But there's flexibility in there to do what we think is right, as opposed to, I think, the others that there's it's locked down and you can't. So we appreciate that.
Kathy.
So I think I just have one question, couple comments. Yeah, I kind of agree with Robin's there, as I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the whole idea that people would go wholesale to them, but I trust that we're going to get there in the end, hopefully, with doing what's right for kids. So I think everybody always has the best interest of kids at heart when they're putting the stuff together. On the, I know you answered the question somebody had about the busing to Front Range Community College and Centennial being cut, but my question was just a little bit different than that, is how do we expect that is going to that's going to affect kids' access to those programs?
I think that over time, just in general, that's a conversation we'll have to have on our end to make sure we provide access. Centennial provides a critical option for students right now, and so does the Pathways program. And so once we're able to look at what's going on and what's happening, what are the number of buses we'd have to do to make sure we provide access and opportunity, I think is a conversation we'll have to have internally once we know what they are. I think we don't have a tremendous amount of participation in the busing to the Pathways program right now. Matt, do you know the numbers that are actually used? It's pretty small, 14. So is there another way to mitigate that? I think those are conversations we've been engaging in outside of this conversation, is how do we mitigate that so that kids have access and it doesn't feel like it's too big of a drain on the system to try to provide access, because there may be other ways to do that.
Thank you. So as far as the lighting, I remember when a new superintendent started here in PSD, she said something along the lines of, you don't build a parking lot to accommodate the school play. And it seems like the overlap in times that we have are fairly short, right? And and other districts have mitigated it, so I sure would like to see us pursue options for mitigating it, although the equity concern does concern me, because apparently we're willing to pay $100 an hour down at Fossil Ridge for those kids to play sports at night, but we aren't at other schools, and that kind of equity makes me feel not okay. And so those are sort of my competing values there that I have going on, because really $100 an hour to light a flipping football field or whatever, how is that okay? It's just, I'm sure I just don't understand the scale of it, but it seems large. So I just wanted to take a minute to just sort of tell you what my thoughts are about where everything is. First, I want to say thank you for all the staff time, for all the community and volunteer time, for the time that everybody put into really thinking about this, for the time that everybody took to fill out even the surveys and give input into this, because it's a huge thing. It impacts a lot of our community. What I think I see overall in all of the data you've presented us is that 2/3 of the people want change. And if we had, 8 options, we might still have the current number looking big compared to splitting out the change between all the other options. I do believe that, from my perception, is that you're right, is that the end times were a reason a lot of people went with option A as opposed to option B. So I guess right now, in my thinking, I'm really looking that I think option B, modified, sounds like an awesome option. And I just wanted to put that out there, because I think that you guys have done a lot of work. You've given us the information that we need to go forth and make a decision. And personally, I don't see a whole lot of need to spend a lot of time other than what's already been spent, thinking about other people might be at a different place, but that's kind of where I am. So thanks for all your work on this.
Okay, other board, Susan, did you want to chime in yet, or I see you writing a book over here, so let's, yeah. All right.
Mine are kind of a hodgepodge of stuff, because I'm listening to my colleagues and your questions, and so it I don't know where to begin. Maybe just a comment. As I was reading the responses, I just thought there was a little irony in the fact that the lowest rate of response was from high school parents, staff, and students. And yet this whole process that we're going through is meant to impact them. So I just thought that I would throw that out there. I probably would have expected a lot more buy-in from that particular group. I have a question about the lighting. Well, the expense of it, for one thing. The $4 million is daunting to me. But you also mentioned in your study that it would be a multi-year project. And so my question would be, what do we do in the meantime while we're working on that? What the plan is for accommodating sports. But the other thing is, you mentioned, did you use the word mitigating athletics? What was the word you used, Scott? I forgot. Compress. What? How?
I don't know what word I use, Susan.
Because I guess, what did you say?
Well, so you compress practices.
Yeah.
If you have practices, I'll give you an example that I heard when I was talking to one of the high school groups. Their football practices extend out 3.5, 4 hours. When you start talking about film study and lifting, do you need that much time? You don't. And coaches will argue with me, but I was a coach. I remember what you do. You can be efficient. And that's what's happened in Cherry Creek and Thompson. They've had to become more efficient. You also have to, what Russ would say is stack practices. When you have multiple different levels of practices, you have the flexibility to spread them out, particularly early in the fall. When you have daylight till 7:30 or 8 o'clock, you can spread those out. And so you have to stack them so they're practicing at the same time. You're more efficiently using your fields. And so those are some of the things we would have to do. And it becomes challenging when you move into late October, November. There's no question that becomes challenging, and we'll have to think through how do we practice if in fact we're getting out of school at 4. And I think when I looked, I think it was November 4th, sunsets at 4:53. So at that point, you're talking 45 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and that's getting kids out to the practice field fast. So what our options would be, it would be to look at fields we own that are lit. So Fossil has one. Pooter has one, but right now, I believe the deal we have is we can only use the lights up there 18 times a year. So that was when we put the lights in, that was the negotiated deal with the families up there. I believe that's right, Sandra, is that?
Yes, and that's one of the things that you have to be aware of is that lighting a field in a neighborhood is a community, city issue. Lots of opportunities for comment,
Yep.
and you end up trying to find your way through that with each neighborhood, and so that 18 is a result of when that field was first put in.
So we've had early conversations with the city. The city has lit ball fields, baseball fields at City Park. Currently, they shut the bathrooms at those, they shut down the day after daylight savings time. Would they negotiate with us and move? We don't know yet. We haven't got that far. Fossil Ridge, ironically, has a lit football field and 2 lit baseball fields. So there's others around the city that we'd have to look at and see, could we make that work? You're talking about, I think it was Kathy that talked about, it's a short duration. It's not very long. So it's sort of the same conversation you have when you talk about air conditioning. You don't need air conditioning very long, but some would say when you need it, you need it. You feel like you need it at least. Playing it after dark becomes impossible. So those are the kinds of things we'll have to sort through. And we will, with whatever the charge we're given is, we'll figure out what the options are and move through it. Once you have a lit field, then you have the ability to do lots on it. So if it's ours, we can do more on it than we can if it's a city field and we don't have control of it. Providing when we put lights on it, we don't get stuck only being able to use it 18 times a year, then it doesn't help us much either. So it's, and I don't have any idea how that happened. That happened a long, long time ago. But that is, Sandra's exactly right. If we start to think about how to do that, they're tough conversations to light fields where they already exist. Please.
Are we talking at all about any middle school sports when you're looking at practices or anything of that sort?
Right now, and I think that's a good topic to talk a little bit about, because I've heard a little bit of conversation about middle school sports. One of the things that's powerful, I think, about any of the scenarios we landed on is our robust middle school programs are relatively untouched. Russ doesn't believe we have to do anything with the middle school programs. Even if what you select is B and the schools get out 20 minutes later than they do now, they should be able to do practices relatively the same time they're doing now, and game time should be able to stay at 3:30. So that makes the mitigation at middle school 0, which is pretty slick. When you think some of the other districts that move middle schools late, the latest end times, we'd have a pickle if we were looking at that for our middle school sports program. So I think that's a positive with all 3 scenarios, whether it's current A or B.
Nate.
I kind of feel like I'm in an episode of Seinfeld with the anti-dentites. Now we're going with anti-lighting. I just want to put in a plug for the fact that even though it's a lot of money, it's over a long period of time, or a period of time, and it's an investment that's going to last a long time. So I don't think we want to make a decision in the short term that's going to affect the long-term co-curricular activities that I think are important, as many other activities are in the district. So I did want to say that, but I also wanted to echo the thanks, and I won't go on at length. I'll just say ditto what other people had said. And it seems to me that we need to give serious consideration to what I heard Board President Fev say earlier tonight, that I would be in favor of making a decision about whether we make a change or we stay with the current situation before we get into a discussion of which scenario might be the most optimal. We don't have to do that, but that would be my preference. I think that's it. Thanks.
Okay, maybe I could throw a question in, and then I'll start a second round. And Carolyn, you haven't gotten one yet. Okay. It's interesting because I started this whole discussion whenever that was, a year or 2 years ago, curious about the impact on the youngest students, and kind of have just gone through a whole cycle of things on that question. I think I'm slowly moving away from the concern, but I do notice that particularly with scenario A and B, one of the big distinction is who gets to start the earliest. It looks like in A, it's the middle school kids get up early, and in B, the elementary school kids get to get up earlier. And it looked to me like quite an impact in scenario B. All of a sudden, a lot of the elementary schools are starting at 7:45. And then in the last week or two, we had one article finally come in that did talk about impacts. It seems like it didn't say much, but it did talk about effects possible for elementary school students. So I guess I throw out the question to you, whether what you thought of that article, or if you've had time to read it, and or to the board, whether anybody is bothered by that aspect of these changes. So I'll start with you, Scott.
Yeah, I would say when I looked at the article, and I think you talked there some about the social economic differences, right? I think that's something that we haven't talked directly about, and I don't think we've seen it in other research. So that was fascinating for me in that one, was the differences for the affluent students. It's tended to impact a little bit more than the others, and you can come up with the options as to why that might be. It didn't give us those, so it didn't tell us why. So that really was my response as I think about, did it change my thinking or add a whole lot of new information? It didn't add a lot of new information for me.
Okay, and before I ask the board, another way I was thinking about it is there a way for us to quantify whether we would prefer one age group over the other to end up starting earlier? How many students are affected? You know, are the middle schoolers who tend to be, between 10 and 13 age group, are they more capable of starting early or less capable? And how many of them, I don't know if there's a way to quantify it, and I'd take it from you and or Ron.
Yeah, a couple things I would say, even before digging into who might be better to start early. I think that when you look at, if in fact what you do is look at B, the earliest anyone starts in the district is 7:45. When you look at current, we have schools starting as early as 7:25. And so I think another example that I'll give you that I heard from principals last week when I was talking to the secondary principals was, in that particular group, one principal said, if we were starting our high school students at 9 o'clock, and we were doing the reverse conversation, and we were saying we want to start our high school students, they're currently starting at 9, and we want them to start at 7:30, would we be engaged in the conversation? And so that was their way of flipping it around. I think the research we've seen is challenging on some level, because it does speak to what's happening to the brain of the late middle school, high school student, and their sleep rhythms moving later in the day, that's what research says. And you see that as you work with secondary students. You can see in a middle school, the students who come in ready to go early in 6th grade, they come in and they're energized, and first period they have a lively class. By the time in 8th grade, and when we were junior highs in 9th grade, first hour classes were pretty lethargic. I think you saw that. That's what the board member in Thompson's reported they're seeing anecdotally in Thompson right now, is a change in the readiness of the students in high school. But I'm not equipped to say which group is better or not. I think I don't know that I've seen a lot of evidence on the elementary.
Okay, Rob?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot on the elementary either, and I guess my understanding, for what it's worth, is that these changes happen around puberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the sleep rhythms of the students, right? Getting needing to go to bed later, frankly, and get up earlier. And get up later. So at some level, almost as I understand it, the answer to your question is how many of our kids are entering puberty at what time, and then of course some kids are not in the same generalization category and have different biology all by them, for whatever reason. My sense was, and I'd have to go back and read all the articles again to be sure about it, but my sense was that there was while the bulk of the references I think were to high school students, my sense was that there was some inclusion in the research of so-called middle school students as benefiting from this. But I think that's, again, all of this, the whole reason, as far as I'm concerned anyway, the whole reason we're even considering this is the science and biology of how our students, and how any students, how kids grow up and what their needs are. So I know that's not a great answer, but it's really the basis of what we're doing.
And to be clear, we won't be looking at the same research for elementary schools students 10 years from now. That's maybe the question that's out there.
Understood.
Carolyn?
Okay, well, I think I want to get us focused back on doing what's good for kids. I want us to think about, when we make this decision, what's going to be the best thing for kids. And I think I'd like to start off by reading a part of a letter that we got from a parent about changing school start times. And she says here, unfortunately, I think the wide-ranging benefits of later school start times, including economic, social, emotional, psychological, and physical, have been undersold throughout this process. If PSD is going to change school start times, the benefits will need to be touted a bit more loudly and clearly, in my opinion. In fact, this position statement, and she had attached it, on changing school start times from the Society of Behavioral Medicine suggests, and a communication plan should be created to ensure the benefits of later school start times are not undersold and the importance of sleep is emphasized. And I think that for me, I need to, when I'm making this decision, to look at what's best for our kids. And I think that the research and the work that Scott and the committee has done, I think it's pretty conclusive that later start times are going to be better for our kids. And so I'm very much interested in pursuing a change in start time for our kids.
Great. And Kristen, did you have another question, comment?
Sure. I absolutely agree, Carolyn. And I, from a sample of 2, at my house, I can certainly tell you that the later you start, the better off everybody is. So I know it's a small sample, but we have the science behind it. We have we know that as kids get older, that their sleep cycles change. So be focusing on that. What's best for the kids. I do want to also say that, yes, Kathy, when you had mentioned, and I think, Scott, you too also mentioned, with the fields, to look at it through an equitable lens is very different than looking at it through the monetary and how many times can we use it and that sort of thing. So that's a really interesting take on that, that I need to go ahead and process that, because from an equitable standpoint, that is very different, that Poudre doesn't have lights, but Fossil has lights on all their fields. So makes you go, or...
Yeah, Fossil has lights on their football field, and then the city put in the 2 baseball fields, and they're both
gotcha.
lit. So just to be, but
even so, it just means that their fields are lighted, and
Yep.
up the road here they're not. So that's a distribution to be considering. So thank you for bringing that up as well. I appreciate that. But once again, I think the work that you've done is tremendous. The work that the community has put into this to say what their feelings on this. I mean, we had 500 pages of comments, which was amazing. So, and some of those comments were kind of fun to read. You know, you'd have one comment that said, absolutely do this, and then the next comment would say, absolutely do not do this. So it was,
It was like they were talking to each other, sort of. I mean, it was sort of,
some of them almost, yeah, it was fun. But no, I just appreciate all the work that went into this, and I think the focus is to keep what's best for the kids. So I agree. Thank you.
Rob? Okay. I think, Dr. Smyser, did you want to make some comments?
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that we sometimes take for granted and don't consider what a crucial part of every community we are. We educate everyone's children, but we also light up their neighborhoods sometimes. And I think this is one of those few times where we recognize that we're trying to do what's best for other people's children, because what we do impacts every family in this community. So it impacts the schedules that young teens are given to work hourly wages after or before school. Those employers know when our end times are and adjust their employment schedules for kids. We will likely impact traffic in all kinds of interesting ways like we do now, but they will just be different, and everyone has adjusted to the start times in every neighborhood of every school, and everyone knows exactly what road to avoid at what time, and all of those people will have to readjust and take another road at a different time. And so I appreciate the sober thoughts that you have and the time that you've taken to arrive at a decision. And I would just like to give you some confidence that we will be careful and thoughtful. The sooner you make the decision, the more time we have to engage with all of those other groups and let them have the time as well to adjust to any change that we might make, because it isn't just us adjusting and individual families, it's all kinds of citywide adjustments that will naturally happen as a result.
Okay. And Susan, did you?
Back to athletics. I just have a couple more questions. My assumption when you were saying that the city could provide lit fields and things of that sort, that I think that begs the question whether a lot of the students who might have otherwise been practicing at their own schools are going to be hopping in their cars and getting somewhere else in order to go to that facility where they can practice.
I think, and that Thompson helps transport students there. Yeah. I would think that if we're truly trying to create access and opportunity, we would want to figure out how to support that. But I think those are things we'd have to work out. We don't even know, Susan, we've had initial conversations to know what the city does, but we don't necessarily know yet whether the city would have fields we could access on a day-to-day basis for the time we need to do it. That's something we'd have to engage in once we know what the charge is, and try to work with them to have access as best we can. But I think we'd have to take a look at how we transport. I think having less kids participate in athletics would be a negative outcome, as I think about that. I mean, I think we talk about connections a lot, and kids being connected to the things they're interested in, including athletics, is important.
Do you find that, or do you anticipate that because school would be going later and the rest of the state is not going to be with us in terms of their start times for games, that our students would be missing a lot more school to accommodate that?
I think it would be hard for me to say right now that they won't. I do believe there's has been some negotiation with the districts that have moved, so they've found successes when working with other school districts, and I think we would engage in the same conversation. We would control some of what we do here, so that's half your games, and we would work with the districts we're playing, as I think Cherry Creek did, and they saw some success. So, and as more schools have the conversation and begin to move, I think it would be more likely that you see time slide back. But if you're an early adopter which we would be if we were to move in 19. We'd be one of the early districts to move, and we don't even know that the others will. I mean, we could make some assumptions that there'll be some energy that continues, but who knows? So it would be hard for me to say that if some game times stay the same, that some students wouldn't miss more school than they're missing now. But there's no guarantee either way.
Okay, I'll go with Rob and then Nate.
So I have a more general comment, but just to address the question that Susan brought up, I think and this actually leads into the general comment. First of all, I think the flexibility you were talking about with respect to early times, what we do with quote-unquote 0-hour kind of times, may or may not, mitigate how much school athletes are missing. So if there are some classes in 0-hour, they may be able to cut out early to go to their game or whatever. More generally, though, I want to expand or add to a little bit what Dr. Smizer said, and that is that I think a lot of what we're talking about here, I mean, there are definitely real concerns involved in all this. There's no question about that. I don't mean to minimize any of these concerns, right? I mean, there's the athletic concerns, there's other extracurricular concerns, there's childcare concerns, there's all of these kind of concerns. I understand that. I will say that I've also spoken to board members in both Cherry Creek and Thompson, and the concerns that were expressed before implementation in both of those places were similar, if not identical, to the ones that we're hearing. And by and large, I guess the right way to say it is that folks have adjusted, right? The folks in the schools have adjusted, the staff has adjusted, the students have adjusted, the employers outside the schools have adjusted, and anecdotally, in the case of Thompson, and via some measurement in the case of Cherry Creek, we're seeing some better, at least mental health outcomes, and potentially better academic outcomes, or at least preparedness for learning outcomes in both of those places. So again, it reminds me a little bit. It's not the same scale, because there are more effects of this change than the one I'm going to reference. But it reminds me a little bit of the transition to middle school from junior highs here in the district. I was pretty heavily involved in that discussion at the time as a volunteer, and there were a lot of concerns from parents, and to some degree from students, and to some degree from staff about potential negative effects. And my sense is that we don't hear about that anymore. I'm not hearing for sure, and I haven't heard anybody tell me that they've heard that people are saying, oh my gosh, that was a terrible decision, we shouldn't have done that. Instead, what we've done is we've tried to reap the benefits of that change, and folks all around have adjusted to it. Again, I understand this is potentially, because of the external impacts, this is potentially more broad-reaching than that. But I think, as Carolyn was saying, we need to look at what the benefits, the direct benefits are for the students, and if we can build a system that continues to provide excellent opportunities for our students, both in school and in extracurriculars and athletics, and reap those benefits, then I think that's what we need to do. And so So I mean, it's no secret that I'm in favor of seeing the start times change here. But
okay, Nate, and then Susan.
Yeah, obviously I agree that it's a big decision. There are major impacts, major adjustments by the whole community will have to occur if we decide to change start times. It's my view that students missing school for athletics is going to be driven to some extent in the short term by the number of bus drivers that we hire. Currently in Thompson School District, athletes that have afternoon games are picked up at a time that allows the bus driver to get back for their afternoon route, so that we don't have to have extra drivers, because we don't have extra drivers to do that. In the longer term, it may be a matter of when the games are scheduled, and that may work itself out. I know Scott referenced it as an assumption, but it's my belief that even though I'm undecided about whether it's the right change at this time, I believe, or I agree with those that say in the midterm, I think that many school districts will change their start times. And the question is whether we're an early adopter in this process, or whether the Poudre School District is a later adopter. So I don't, as far as times for activities that don't mesh with other districts, I think in 10 years, or maybe it'll take 15 years, those things are going to work themselves out. And nothing's inevitable, and this is a big decision, but that's my view. So obviously it's a big decision, and we'll have to think hard about it.
Susan.
Looking at the, coming back to the cost of buses for each of the scenarios and that kind of thing, I'm looking at that and looking at the lighting. And who knows, what other costs we're going to incur, because there are so many unknowns. Do you anticipate, we were talking about perhaps having to drop or adjust busing to Centennial or to Front Range Community College and things of that sort. Do you anticipate any other adjustments that might have to be made to programs in the district in order to accommodate this change? Because it seems like it's pretty monumental.
Yeah, Susan, nothing that jumps out that feels like it's either one of the bus cost or the lighting cost. There could be some cost. There could be some financial benefits also. I think one of the challenges could be coaches, for instance. That could be a challenge. It might not be a challenge. It might be a benefit for us, because if we start our practices a little later, you actually may open up the opportunity for people that can't coach currently to coach. But it might be the reverse of that. And if that's true, much like buses a year ago when we couldn't find bus drivers, we had to figure out how to adjust market value for bus drivers. So is there capacity for expenses like that to be in the system? Maybe. It's hard to predict. Those we felt like we knew, there are hard costs we can figure out. Matt's group can figure out how many buses we believe we need, and we can see a fixed cost to that. It was relatively easy to go through and say, in a perfect scenario, if we were to give every site 2 fields that are lit, we could figure out a cost to that, and then we could identify what's the cost to run it. So those were easy to identify and easy to see. Some of the other ones, again, could be a cost add. It might be a cost benefit. We may find both of those as we make a shift, and it's hard for me to predict those right now.
Rob, and then Kathy.
Yeah, so we've talked about early adopter versus later adopter. At some level, I'm feeling like we're sort of a middle adopter. Maybe that's early mid adopter. I don't know. Obviously Thompson and Cherry Creek have already gone ahead with this. As I understand it, Boulder's reconsidering whether they're going to go ahead with it or not. So I think it's absolutely true that we don't know what the future is going to hold, but there is some momentum in this space. As far as costs are concerned, I think we purposely, at least with respect to the busing costs, we purposely allocated additional money into the board reserve last year on the possibility that we would need to have some big capital expenditure for buses or something else to support this. I know that doesn't support $4 million in lighting, but for the buses, I think we've got that covered. As for the lighting costs, what I heard, and oh, by the way, on the busing, well, for the lighting and for the Centennial and Front Range, what I heard was that we'll look at what we can do to mitigate the situation. And so, in fact, the $4 million cost on lighting is in some ways a maximum. I mean, it's not an absolute maximum. Obviously, we could maybe, if we get agreement from neighborhoods and whatever, light a whole lot of other stuff. But I mean, it's an, as you, I think you said, I don't forget the, again, I'm trying to remember the word you used. It wasn't perfect or ideal or so, I forget the exact word. But, you know, if we just wanted to keep doing what it says in the report, actually, you sent, I think, is if we were just going to keep doing what we're doing now in terms of the length of practices and the number of practices or whatever, this is what we'd have to do. We'd have to
Yeah,
spend $4
we
million.
felt like we could do that with 2 fields at each site.
Right, right.
And
And what
so
I'm
you
saying
look
is
at what's
if you
happened.
find other mitigating
Yeah.
approaches that may not need to be as high a cost as that. I'm not saying it's a zero cost.
Yep.
I'm not saying for equity reasons we shouldn't do something about this, but I'm not sure that the $4 million bill is the right number to be worried about.
I think that's fair, Rob. I think
Okay.
that's exactly right. I think what we put together was what we thought was ideal, and there are other ways to solve that issue.
Okay, Kathy.
I would agree that I don't think we're an early adopter. I think we would have been an early adopter 5 years ago. I think right now there's a ever increasing trend for school districts to adopt earlier hours, and I don't want us to be a late adopter. We don't want to be last on the block to have the newest swing set, do we? So I guess I wanted to just point out some of the things I didn't point out in my earlier comments. This board has been very concerned, rightly so, about the mental health of our students. And one of the benefits is improved mental health of students when they have adequate amounts of sleep. That's a preventative thing. You know, I don't know that we can just stick an absolute number on it, but would we rather hire more mental health support people on our mental health team? Well, yeah, that would be great too, but part of the cost of what we would be doing here is doing preventative costs, okay? Mental health, reduced incidence of, reduced incidency of obesity, reduced incidence of traffic accidents, better academic performance. One of the articles, letters to the editor this weekend, I think it was one of the sleep specialists who was on our team for our committee for later school start times, talked about improved athletic performance for those kids who get more sleep, right? It's not all a downside for athletics. And there is a cost, I want to remind everybody, in the current plan too. When we look at all of the different scenarios, if everybody remembers, there was a base cost to just the current plan because we continue to have more and more students every year, and so we will have to pay for more costs. So actually, when you look at the cost of each of those plans, you need to take the cost of each of those plans and then subtract off what the current cost was, which I don't remember the exact numbers. Yeah, well, it was a largish number. So I just wanted to put all those things out there because you might say it costs a lot of money to move forward, and I think there's a lot of benefits to it, and there's a lot of money that we wouldn't have to spend in other places, and not just the money, but the cost to our kids of not doing what is best for them. Because if it's our job to educate kids, shouldn't we give them the best opportunities to learn that we can, and giving kids adequate amounts of sleep is key.
Kathy, I'm going to say that your comments about the mental health have been pretty important to me as well, actually. As I weigh everything, I think it feels like it's a lot of impact to our community at large, but as far as financially, I tend to agree that it's not a large cost for what could be a pretty significant benefit. So if you're looking for which way I'm leaning. I think you guys over the, the whole team over the year has had a pretty significant impact on how I'm thinking about it right now. So, are there other final comments, questions? We haven't laid out too many more questions for staff that I heard. And you guys will just have to make sure to, if there are questions, get them out there, and we'll try to get staff on that. One more, or yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Well, it's more of a question for you and the board. I know a couple of us have expressed interest in moving up the vote to the November work session instead of waiting till December, giving the staff more time to do planning. Where is everybody else with moving up the vote potentially?
And I think that could be feasible. I thought what we'd do is just have a discussion in agenda setting and talk about how we might want to do this and see if we just want to move forward with the vote at the next meeting. I don't think there'd be much resistance on the board. Is that accurate? Okay. So why don't we look at doing that? It'll make the next meeting kind of an interesting one and give it some marching orders. So
Make it a little interesting.
no, I'm just
too,
saying because we'll already have the legislative, and yeah, so just keep ourselves going. Okay, with that, thank you very much, from all of us for all the work you've been doing, Lauren Hooten, everybody on staff, really something else. So